Welcome, I am Mr. Clock, the creator of the Arma 3 Object Builder add-on for Blender. In this video I would like to talk about some of the specifics of the P3D export process. Setting up a proper P3D model in Blender is a relatively complex task, and we might run into a number of issues when we are trying to first export our model. So first I would like to go over some of the common issues when first trying to export something. Let's say that I have this model, which is a chamfered cube, and I want to export this as a P3D. So I will go to File, Export, Export Arma 3 Model. I will navigate to my folder and name this box. Then I will try to export. And it fails, and it gives us a specific reason. It says there are no loads to export. What this error means is that there are currently no load objects in the scene, or if we enable the selected only, then it means that there are no currently selected load objects in the scene. So what this basically means is that we forgot to set our objects to load objects, so we can quickly do that. Come to the load properties. This is a load resolution 1, and then we can go and export again. And this time we get a much more intimidating errors. If we open up the system console as it said at the end, we can actually see what's happening, and the error actually describes what the issue is. It says all loads failed validation, cannot write P3D with 0 loads. In this case, it also tells us in the processing log that the validation failed, it skipped the load, and that we should run manual validation to actually find out what the problem with our load is. So we can actually do that. We can go to validation, validate, and see that it says the mesh has n-gons. Oh, okay, so that means that when I chamfer the box, I forgot to triangulate the model. This face is obviously not a quad or a triangle, so I will quickly add a triangulation modifier to the object. And this time the export should succeed. Right, and we can actually see that the export properly went over one load with the proper metadata that we want to see. Another very common reason for this to happen is not a topological error, because for example P3D files cannot store n-gon faces, so this is simply just not possible to do. But also, for example, if this was a geometry load and we forgot to assign vertex masses to this load, actually I do need the triangulation, and when we export, if I enable validate loads option and try to export, again I will get the same error as before, which says that all loads failed validation, cannot write P3D with 0 loads, which means that it went over the loads, it tried to validate it for the geometry load type, and it failed, and because in this case this was the only load, that means that there were zero loads that it could export, and it cannot write a P3D with 0 loads. Therefore, it's giving an error, and it is telling us to run the manual validation to actually find out what happened with the object. So if we run the validation, we can see that it has a bunch of issues. It has no components, it has no vertex masses. Obviously, we didn't do that for this geometry object. So these are the most common errors. Now the question is, what happens when an export fails? As we can see, even though the last export failed because of this geometry issue, we still have an object, and this object seems to be the previous export, which is the resolution 1, which was the last successful export. And this is exactly right. So what the export process will do is it will first export to a temporary file in order to preserve the last actually existing file. It will create a new file which will be the same name, except it will have a time step appended to it. with a P3D extension, and it will write all the P3D data to this file. And then if the export finished without errors, then the original file will be deleted and the temporary file will be renamed to be in place of the original. This way, if an error occurs during the export will simply just stop and erase the temporary file and tell us that it couldn't export. If we want, we can enable an option in the preferences to preserve temporary files in the debug section. This is useful if you want to submit a bug report on GitHub, for example. You could attach the temporary file that it failed with. Alright, and a very similar thing might happen if you have the backup option enabled. Currently I have this disabled, but if I had this enabled, what would happen is it would first create a temporary file, write all the P3D to that temporary file. Then it would create a copy of the original file with a backup extension. And then, if the export is successful, it will erase the original file, rename the temporary file, and this way, even if the export succeeds, we still have one backup of the previous working version of the model. So this is mainly about the temporary and export process. And then finally, the last thing I want to show is that there is actually a way to avoid creating multiple duplicate copies of the same object just for different LODs. So let's say that I want to use this LOD, which is a resolution LOD, so I will quickly change it back. I want to use this as a first-person view, which is a view pilot LOD as well. But I don't want to create a separate object for this. A solution to this problem is the copy directives. If we go to the LOD object, there is below the name properties and proxy access lists, there is a copies list, and we can add items to this. So for example, I can add the copy here, and I can say that I want this copy to be a view pilot and with no resolution in this case. And if I go to export model, disable the validation for now, export, we can see that it actually exported two LODs instead of just the one that we have. And if we open the file, we can see that the view pilot is exactly identical as the first one. Now, doing this can actually result in another issue, another error. If we have two of the same LOD type, in this case resolution 1, that creates an issue in the P3D, which might be a problem for us. If we export the model this way, we get an error which says duplicate LODs detected. The reason this happens is because in the export by default we have the collisions handling set to fail, which means if we have more than one LOD with the same signature, the export fails and doesn't overwrite the working file we have. If we don't want this to fail, we should leave it to fail, but we can change it to either ignore, which means that it will export both LODs with the same signature, which may or may not be a big problem for us later. Or we can set to skip, which means that it will export the first LOD with the signature, but it will not export the second one. So if we go to ignore export, it succeeds. We can see in the export log that it exported resolution 1 twice. And if we open up the file, we can see that there are actually two resolution 1s here. And then if we export with the skip option, we can see that it only exported one of the two LODs because the second LOD was a duplicate, as it says right here. So if we open the P3D resulting, you can see that we still only get one of the lots. And this can not only happen with copy directives, this can happen with manually setting up lots as well by accident. So in my opinion, it is best to leave the export option to fail. That way we can actually see that we made a mistake. If all else break, you can just set it to skip. I do not encourage to set it to ignore. So these are basically the options I wanted to go over. I hope you find them useful. Thank you.